The night was cold, the kind that seeps into your bones and makes you shiver. Carl Perkins was playing in a small, smoky nightclub in Jackson, Tennessee. The place was packed with locals, their laughter and chatter blending with the hum of the music. Carl's fingers danced over the guitar strings, and the audience swayed to the beat. But it was the young couple in the corner that caught his eye. They were moving fast, their bodies almost a blur. The girl was laughing, her face bright and free, but suddenly they stopped. The boy looked down at his feet, his face turning red. "And now, don't you step on my suedes," he muttered, his voice a mix of embarrassment and anger. The girl's smile faded, and she looked hurt. Carl couldn't help but feel for her. He didn't own a pair of suede shoes himself, but if he did, he would have given them to her without a second thought. That night, the image of the couple haunted Carl. He lay awake, the words, "Don't step on my blue suede shoes," echoing in his head. He tossed and turned, trying to shake the image, but it wouldn't leave him. At 3 o'clock in the morning, he finally gave up on sleep. He got out of bed and started rummaging around the house, looking for something to write on. His 2 babies were sleeping soundly, and the house was quiet. He found 3 Irish potatoes in a brown paper bag and grabbed a pencil. In the dim light, he scribbled down the words, "Don't step on my blue suede shoes." He didn't even know how to spell suede, but it didn't matter. The song was born. The next morning, Carl called Sam Phillips, the owner of Sun Records. He sang the song to Sam over the phone, and Sam loved it. "We've got to record this," Sam said. Carl and his band were booked for a session at Sun Studio. Sam had a knack for making magic happen. He encouraged Carl and the band to play the song faster, adding more energy to it. He also suggested a change in the lyrics. "Go man go sounds too country," Sam said. "Try go cat go." The word cat gave the song a different feel, something more modern and cool. Carl agreed, and the song took on a new life. On January 1st, 1956, Blue Suede Shoes was released, and it was an instant hit. The energetic, fast-paced number was perfect for dancing, and the lyrics spoke to rebellious teenagers everywhere. The song shot up the charts, becoming a hit on pop, country, and rhythm and blues charts. It was the first million-selling record for Sun Records, and Carl Perkins was suddenly a star. Elvis Presley, who had recently left Sun Records for RCA, was thrilled for his friend. He called Carl to congratulate him, telling him how much he loved the song, but success was short-lived. On March 22, 1956, Carl and his band were on their way to New York City for a TV appearance when disaster struck. Their vehicle collided with a truck, and Carl's manager and the truck driver were killed instantly. Carl and his brothers, Jay and Clayton, were seriously injured. Jay never fully recovered and died from a brain tumor a couple of years later. Clayton struggled with the accident and later took his own life. Carl was hospitalized for weeks, his body and spirit broken. Lying in his hospital bed, Carl watched Elvis perform on TV. He wondered what might have been. Sam Phillips had planned to surprise him with a gold record, but now that seemed like a distant dream. Elvis, always the gracious friend, sent Carl a telegram offering his help. When Carl was finally well enough, Elvis changed his set list for a TV show, removing Blue Suede Shoes out of respect for his friend. Despite the setback, Carl's influence on rock and roll was undeniable. His song, Blue Suede Shoes, became a classic, and his style inspired countless artists, including the Beatles, who later covered several of his songs. Carl Perkins was a true pioneer of rockabilly, and his legacy would live on, long after the night he wrote the song that changed his life forever. Johnny Cash was a man of deep contrast. Despite his smile, he often seemed sad, usually dressed in dark, drab colors, and even wrote a song called "The Man in Black" to explain his choice of clothing. He saw it as a way to stand in solidarity with those who were struggling in the world. His dark hair, intense brown eyes, and serious expression only added to this image. But this wasn't just an act. It was a reflection of his roots as a poor country boy from rural Arkansas, where he was born to sharecropper parents. Cash grew up listening to the Grand Ole Opry on the radio, and he was deeply inspired by country music legends like Hank Williams, Ernest Tubb, Roy Acuff, and the Louvin Brothers. "Nothing in the world was more important to me than hearing those songs on the radio," he said later. This was the music, and these were the great artists who helped me learn how to tell real song stories from personal experiences and places and things I'd felt and seen. One of the most significant moments in his life was when he saw the Louvin brothers perform live. It was then that he knew he wanted to be a musician. His friends didn't believe in him, but his mother always did. You're gonna be a singer on that radio," she would say, and Cash never forgot her words. By his early teens, Cash was already singing and writing gospel and country songs. He even performed regularly on a local radio station in Blytheville, Arkansas. After serving in the Air Force, he moved to Memphis with dreams of becoming a radio announcer. But life had other plans, and he ended up selling vacuum cleaners door to door. Still, he kept playing music, and eventually formed a band with guitarist Luther Perkins and bassist Marshall Grant. Cash and his band, known as the Tennessee Two, auditioned for Sam Phillips at Sun Records in 1955. Phillips, the owner of Sun Records, was initially unsure about Cash but saw potential in him. He told Cash to go home, write some songs like those Elvis Presley was recording, and come back. Cash did just that, and soon he was back in the studio with Phillips. One of the most unique aspects of Cash's sound came from a suggestion by Phillips. He had Cash weave a strip of paper between the strings of his acoustic guitar, creating a percussive sound that became a signature part of Cash's music. This sound, combined with the simple but effective playing of Perkins and Grant, gave Cash's music a distinctive and powerful feel. Cash was amazed by Phillips's approach to recording. "Sam didn't have a clock in the studio," Cash later said. "He didn't let me feel like I was spending anybody's money by just singing new songs. After an hour or two, he'd say, 'Okay, what else you got? Let's keep going till we get your best.'" Phillips was determined to bring out the unique qualities in each artist, and this approach helped shape Cash's early success. The sound that emerged from these sessions was different from the typical country music of the time. Instead of fiddles and steel guitars, Cash's music featured a simple but powerful combination of bass, guitar, and his deep, resonant voice. This sound, often described as Spartan, struck a chord with young listeners. Cash's music was honest and straightforward, and it resonated with the values of the time. "I think it was Johnny's integrity and his creative fire that made him so successful," said Chris Christopherson. But above all, it was like he represented the truth. One of Cash's first big hits was "I Walk the Line," released in 1956. The song, with its hypnotic rhythm and heartfelt lyrics about staying true to one's love, became a top 20 hit. The song's sound, with Perkins's guitar licks and Grant's slap bass, was like a train coming down the track, and Cash's mournful voice added to the song's impact. "It was different than anything else you had ever heard," Bob Dylan said later. "The record sounded like a voice from the middle of the earth. It was so powerful and moving. It was profound, and so was the tone of it, every line, deep and rich, awesome and mysterious all at once." Cash's success continued with several hits on the rock and roll charts, and he went on to become a country music superstar. He hosted his own TV show and recorded with many of the era's greatest artists, including Bob Dylan. In 1992, Cash was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. During his acceptance speech, he humbly explained his background in country and blues music, saying, "I'm extremely proud of it, and whether I belong here or not, I'm going to take it and show it off at home." Johnny Cash's music and style continued to resonate with audiences from the 1950s until his death in 2003. Truly, he is what the land and country is all about, the heart and soul of it personified in what it means to be here, said Bob Dylan. If we want to know what it means to be mortal, we need look no further than the man in black. Blessed with a profound imagination, he used the gift to express all the various lost causes of the human soul. Johnny Cash rises high above all, and he'll never die or be forgotten, even by persons not born yet, especially those persons, and that is forever. While Cash and a few others like Elvis Presley and Carl Perkins found immense success, many other Sun rockabilly artists did not. Some, like Roy Orbison, found only limited success at Sun before moving on to other labels where they became stars. Orbison came to Sun at the suggestion of Johnny Cash, but Sam Phillips wanted him to focus on rockabilly rather than ballad. This led Orbison to move to Monument Records in Nashville, where he had a string of hits, including Only the Lonely, running scared and crying. For every success story, there were many others who never achieved the fame they dreamed of. Artists like Warren Smith, Charlie Feathers, Sonny Burgess, Billy Lee Riley, and Van Story had moments of local success but never broke through nationally. Warren Smith, for example, had a local hit with You Bangy Stomp, a song that played into racial stereotypes of the time. Sam Phillips, despite the misses, had a significant impact on the music industry. His pioneering spirit and keen eye for talent helped create some of the best rock and roll songs of the 1950s. Even in retirement, Phillips was proud of his contributions. He loaned his original recording equipment to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame for an exhibit, saying, "People are going to wonder how we got the sound we did out of the equipment we had, but you can overcome a lot of things with just a little pioneering spirit." Elvis Presley's success also inspired other country singers to try their hand at rockabilly. Gene Vincent, a country singer from Norfolk, Virginia, was one of the first to achieve major success. Vincent, who had been in the Navy, formed a band called the Blue Caps and recorded Bebop Elula in 1956. The song, with its echo chamber effect and Vincent's wild, sensuous performance, became a national hit, reaching number 7 on the pop charts. Vincent's appearance and performance style were as rebellious as his music. He had a menacing look, a hostile attitude, and a noticeable limp from a motorcycle accident. He and his band wore brightly colored clothes or black leather jackets, white t-shirts, and pegged pants. They played with wild abandon, and their performances were unforgettable. Jerry Naylor, a rockabilly authority, recalled the first time he saw Vincent perform. When Gene hit the stage, it was as if he took everything Elvis had done and moved it up by several degrees. He had something freer about him, something more reckless, wild, lusty. Vincent's performance in the 1956 film The Girl Can't Help It is a classic example of his style. The scene shows Vincent and the Blue Caps performing Bebop Elula in a rehearsal hall. Vincent, dressed in gray pegged pants and a bright blue multistriped shirt, moves sensually to the beat, his blue cap frequently falling off to reveal his greasy, slicked-back hair. The group's wild energy and Vincent's charismatic presence made the performance a highlight of the film. Although Vincent never had another top 10 hit, he continued to record and perform, capturing the rebellious spirit of the times with songs like Race with the Devil, Blue Jean Bop, and Lotta Lovin'. His main claim to fame, however, remains Bebop Elula, which became one of rock and roll's greatest hits and earned him a place in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. While male rockabilly artists like Elvis, Cash, and Vincent dominated the scene, female rockabilly singers also made their mark. They faced more challenges, but brought their unique styles and voices to the genre. One of the most notable was Wanda Jackson, known as the Queen of Rockabilly. Jackson, who started as a country singer, began to incorporate rockabilly elements into her music in the late 1950s. Her powerful voice and energetic performances made her a standout in the male-dominated world of rockabilly. Jackson's hits, like Let's Have a Party and Fun Fun Fun, showcased her ability to blend country and rock and roll, and she became a role model for future generations of female rockers. Another notable female rockabilly artist was Janis Martin, often called the female Elvis. Martin, who began performing at a young age, had a powerful voice and a dynamic stage presence. She recorded several hits, including Drugstore Man, and her performances were known for their high energy and enthusiasm. Despite her talent, Martin faced the same challenges as other female artists of the time, including limited opportunities and a lack of recognition. However, her contributions to rockabilly were significant, and she is remembered as one of the genre's pioneers. The success of these female artists, though often overshadowed by their male counterparts, helped pave the way for future generations of women in rock and roll. Their music and performances showed that women could be just as powerful and influential in the genre, and their legacy continues to inspire musicians today. By the mid-1950s, rockabilly was sweeping the nation, and while it was mostly a male-dominated scene, a few bold female singers were making their mark. One of these was Jean Chapel, a Kentucky-born blonde who started her career on Sun Records in 1955. She was soon billed as the female Elvis Presley when she moved to RCA. Jean performed at Alan Freed's shows, but despite her talent and good looks, she never hit the big time. Another attempt was made with Barbara Pittman, a Memphis native who also got her start on Sun Records. Like Elvis, her music blended country with R&B, but she struggled to find success. Barbara later suggested that Sun Records didn't know how to market her, especially because of her curvy figure. She joked that the guys at the label didn't know how to fit a size 42 into a 33, and won 3 record albums. Janice Martin from Sutherland, Virginia, had more luck. RCA signed her in 1956 and quickly dubbed her the female Elvis, due to her energetic performances and Elvis-like vocals. Her biggest hit came in 1956 with Will You William, which reached number 50 on the charts. The song's driving beat and Janice's mix of snarling and seductive vocals made it a standout. However, her later releases, like My Boy Elvis and Let's Elope Baby, didn't chart as well. One of the most notable attempts to cash in on Elvis's popularity was the appearance of a singer named Ollie's Leslie. Discovered by an LA disc jockey, she was billed as the female Presley, and made her debut in Hollywood in 1956. She performed with acts like the Coasters and Gene Vincent, but her career didn't take off, and she quickly faded from the spotlight. The most talented and enduring female rockabilly singer was Wanda Jackson. Born in Oklahoma, Wanda grew up in a family of country musicians and began performing on radio at a young age. Her style was a shocking blend of sexy glamour and rockabilly energy. She wore daring outfits that were far from the traditional cowgirl look, often causing controversy. When she met Elvis Presley in 1955, he encouraged her to try rockabilly. She took his advice and released I Gotta Know in 1956, a song that mixed country and rockabilly. Her next release, Hot Dog That Made Him Mad, showed her growing confidence in the new genre. Wanda's rockabilly songs like Fujiyama Mama and Let's Have a Party were excellent, but they didn't become big hits. Despite her talent, the 1950s were not ready for a hard-rocking female singer. Wanda eventually returned to country music, but continued to record rockabilly songs. Her unique style and persistence made her a respected figure in both genres. While female rockabilly singers faced challenges, the genre was growing, and new artists were emerging. Eddie Cochran, with his dynamic performance in the film The Girl Can't Help It, was gaining attention. He would soon hit the charts with Sittin' in the Balcony and Drive-In Show, and later become a superstar with Summertime Blues. In Memphis, Jerry Lee Lewis signed with Sun Records, and in New Mexico, Buddy Knox and Jimmy Bowen began recording at Norman Petty's studio. In Nashville, the young Brenda Lee, already a seasoned performer, signed with Decca. The Everly brothers, Don and Phil, were also on the rise, and after a brief stint with Columbia Records, they signed with Cadence Records in 1957, setting the stage for their future success. Buddy Holly's story is a testament to the evolving rockabilly scene. He and his friends, including J.I. Allison, Sonny Curtis, and Bob Montgomery, started as country musicians in Lubbock, Texas. They played local shows, and even had their own radio segment. But when Holly saw Elvis Presley perform in 1955, everything changed. He was inspired to embrace rockabilly, and began incorporating R&B into his music. Holly and Allison formed the Crickets, and their unique Tex-Mex sound, influenced by artists like Elvis Presley and Ray Charles, would soon make them icons of the genre. By the end of 1956, these up-and-coming artists were ready to take rockabilly to new heights. The genre was expanding, and the stage was set for a new wave of rock and roll stars. Buddy Holly's journey in the music industry was filled with ups and downs, especially in the early days. In late January 1956, he traveled to Nashville to record with Decca Records. His backup band included friends Sonny Curtis on guitar and Don Guess on bass. However, Decca's producer, Owen Bradley, insisted that Holly use Nashville studio musicians instead. This was a significant setback for Holly, as the chemistry between him and his friends was crucial to their sound. Despite this, Holly and his Lubbock friends were allowed to play in the last 2 sessions, but the results were still not what they hoped for. Decca eventually dropped Buddy, and the records from these sessions didn't achieve much success. Despite the disappointment, Holly remained determined. He called Paul Cohen, an A&R man at Decca, and secretly recorded the conversation. Holly asked Cohen for a written release to market 5 of the songs elsewhere. Cohen tried to block him, saying the recordings belonged to Decca and Holly couldn't re-record them for 5 years. Holly argued his case, but Cohen, in a patronizing tone, told Holly not to feel bad about it. Holly was upset but persistent, insisting he wanted to re-record the songs to get them released on another label. Cohen tried to manipulate the situation, offering to hear the new recordings before Holly gave them to anyone else, but Holly saw through it. He ended the call, knowing he had to find another way. Holly and J.I. Allison began reworking the songs and creating new material. They were inspired by other rock and roll artists like Little Richard, Fats Domino, and Chuck Berry. They decided to form a group and named themselves the Crickets, inspired by an old R&B group called the Spiders. Before 1957, Holly and Allison were the only consistent members, and the lineup often changed from gig to gig. Sometimes it was just the two of them performing. This flexibility allowed them to develop a tight, unique sound. They had to fill every musical gap, which made their performances more dynamic and engaging. After the Decca deal fell through, Holly and Allison reached out to Norman Petty, who owned a recording studio in Clovis, New Mexico. Things moved quickly, and the Crickets wrote and recorded several songs, including That'll Be the Day, which became a huge hit in 1957. This marked the beginning of Holly's meteoric rise in the music industry. Buddy Holly was one of many country singers who transitioned to rock and roll in the late 1950s. Some, like Carl Perkins, Gene Vincent, and Johnny Cash, found immediate success. Others, including Holly and the Crickets, Jerry Lee Lewis, the Everly Brothers, and Roy Orbison, took a bit longer to break through. Some, like Thomas Wayne, Ronnie Hawkins, Clyde Stacy, Dale Hawkins, and Wanda Jackson, had their moments in the spotlight but didn't achieve long-term success. By the end of 1956, rockabilly, a blend of country and rhythm and blues, had become mainstream rock and roll. It emerged from the cultural melting pot of the South, where working-class whites and blacks mixed their musical traditions. Rockabilly was a powerful expression of the post-World War II South, combining the emotional intensity of gospel with the raw energy of blues and the storytelling of country music. It spoke to the dreams and fears of young people, reflecting the emerging youth culture of the time. While rockabilly artists found some success, they often played second fiddle to Elvis Presley, who remained the king of rock and roll throughout the decade. Despite this, the rise of rockabilly marked a significant shift in popular music, blending different genres and paving the way for the rock and roll revolution. Holly and the Crickets were at the forefront of this change, and their story is a testament to the power of perseverance and the magic of music. Elvis Presley hit the scene in 1956, and everything changed. Rock and roll wasn't just a fad anymore, it was a force. Elvis brought a new style, a new attitude, and a new way of making music that captured the hearts of millions. His influence spread like wildfire, and before long, rock and roll was everywhere. Artists like Carl Perkins, Gene Vincent, and many others followed in his footsteps, creating a vibrant genre called rockabilly. Meanwhile, Chuck Berry, Fats Domino, and the Five Satins were bringing the rich sounds of rhythm and blues into the mainstream. Pop rock acts like Bill Haley and his Comets, Pat Boone, and the Diamonds also found their place, creating a diverse and exciting musical landscape. Rock and roll didn't just bring new music, it brought a new culture. The 1950s saw a massive migration of African Americans from the South to urban areas in the North and West. They brought with them the rhythms and styles of rhythm and blues, which white Americans were discovering for the first time. This cultural exchange was a key factor in the birth of rock and roll. The new music fused elements from white pop, black rhythm and blues, and country and western, creating a unique sound that appealed to a wide audience. The rise of rock and roll was also tied to the emergence of a new generation. The post-World War II era saw a baby boom, and by the 1950s, millions of young people were coming of age. These teenagers had more money and more leisure time than any previous generation, and they were eager to create their own identity. Rock and roll became the soundtrack to this new youth culture. It wasn't just about the music, it was about the whole package: the fashion, the dance moves, the slang, and the attitudes. Rock and roll taught teenagers how to express themselves, how to date, and how to be part of a community. The music industry saw the potential in rock and roll and jumped on board. Record labels, radio stations, and television shows all played a role in promoting the new sound. Technological advancements, like magnetic tape recorders and 45 RPM records, made it easier to produce and distribute music. Transistor radios and car radios made it possible for people to listen to rock and roll on the go. This helped the music reach a wider audience and solidify its place in American culture. But not everyone was happy about the rise of rock and roll. Critics saw it as a threat to traditional values. They claimed it was turning innocent kids into troublemakers and sexual deviants. Some even suggested it was a communist plot or a tool for racial integration. The media often portrayed rock and roll in a negative light, warning of its dangers. Songs were banned, and some performers were censored. Elvis Presley, in particular, faced scrutiny for his provocative performances and suggestive lyrics. Despite the backlash, rock and roll continued to grow. It wasn't just a music genre, it was a symbol of rebellion. The 1950s were a time of strict social norms and expectations, and rock and roll offered a way to challenge those norms. It was loud, it was bold, and it was unapologetic. Artists like Chuck Berry, with his hit Roll Over Beethoven, were clear that the old ways were out and the new ways were in. Rock and roll performers looked and acted differently from traditional pop stars. They wore wild clothes, had outrageous hairstyles, and spoke in teenage slang. Elvis Presley was the ultimate example, with his flashy outfits and his ability to make audiences go wild. Rock and roll also challenged racial barriers. In an era of segregation, the music brought people together. Black artists like Chuck Berry and Fats Domino were writing and performing songs that appealed to white audiences, while white artists like Elvis Presley and Pat Boone were adopting black musical styles. This mixing of cultures was a powerful force for integration. Some civil rights leaders, like Julian Bond, later credited rock and roll with helping to prepare white youth for the civil rights movement. The sexual energy of rock and roll was another point of tension. The music was filled with suggestive lyrics, sensual performances, and dance moves that were seen as inappropriate by many adults. Teenagers, on the other hand, were drawn to the music's raw and exciting energy. Elvis Presley, with his magnetic stage presence and provocative lyrics, was a prime example of this sexual appeal. His performances often left audiences in a frenzy, and he became a symbol of the new, rebellious youth culture. In the 1950s, rock and roll was more than just music. It was a cultural revolution, a symbol of change, and a voice for a new generation. It challenged the status quo, broke down barriers, and created a space where young people could express themselves freely. The impact of rock and roll on 1950s America was profound, and its legacy continues to shape music and culture to this day. Rock and roll girls were just as sexy and daring as their male counterparts. Songs like Love is Strange by Mickey and Sylvia in 1956 showed that girls could be both good and naughty. Sylvia starts off playing the part of a good 50s girl, but as the song progresses, she lets on that she might be willing to go a bit further. The song's beat and the way Mickey and Sylvia sing to each other make it feel like a flirtatious dance, ending with them coming together in a musical climax. Rock and roll wasn't just about the music. It was about a lifestyle that often clashed with the status quo. Many rock and roll stars came from working-class backgrounds, which made them seem low-class to some people. For example, when Fats Domino's hit, Ain't That a Shame, was sent to a Cleveland DJ named Bill Randall. Randall liked it because it was ignorant. But this ignorance was actually a unique cultural voice, much like the dialect in Mark Twain's novels. When Pat Boone tried to cover the song, he initially wanted to make the lyrics more grammatically correct, but he eventually recorded it as written. Both versions became big hits, much to the dismay of those who thought rock and roll was lowbrow. The divide between the young and the old was clear in the 1950s. Rock and roll wasn't just music. It was a rebellion against the old ways. When Steve Allen, a popular TV host, made fun of Ain't That a Shame on his show, it showed how the establishment viewed rock and roll, but rock and roll fought back. Songs celebrated teenage romance, slang, and the unique culture of youth. The more the establishment criticized rock and roll, the more it became a symbol of youth rebellion. Artists like Elvis Presley and Little Richard, with their wild performances, only added to the controversy. Dion Mucci, a rock and roll pioneer, explained that the attitude behind rock and roll was what made it special. "It's honest, it's simple, you have something to say and you're going to say it," he said. This attitude was a threat to the conservative values of the time. Rock and roll was all about expressing yourself freely, whether it was about sex, race, or other taboo topics. But rock and roll wasn't the only thing pushing boundaries in the 1950s. The civil rights movement was gaining momentum, and black artists were becoming more prominent in music, film, and television. Movies like Carmen Jones and The Defiant Ones featured black actors, and TV shows like Nat King Cole's variety show brought black performers into living rooms across America. Sports, literature, and magazines also saw a rise in black representation. When it came to sex, rock and roll wasn't alone. Hollywood was producing more suggestive films, and sex symbols like Marilyn Monroe and Brigitte Bardot were everywhere. TV shows and commercials also pushed the limits, with sexy dancers and provocative storylines. Even literature was getting steamier, with books like Lolita and Peyton Place becoming bestsellers. The 1950s were obsessed with sex, and rock and roll was just one part of that cultural shift. Despite the rebellion, rock and roll was also a part of the broader American culture. It was patriotic and reflected the values of the time. Rock and roll was almost entirely American, with foreign artists rarely making it to the charts. Artists like Gene Vincent named their bands after American symbols, and songs celebrated American heroes. Rock and roll idols like Elvis Presley and Pat Boone were seen as all-American boys, good-looking, talented, and respectful. Even when Elvis joined the Army, he was praised for his patriotism and good behavior. In the end, rock and roll was both a symbol of rebellion and a part of the larger American culture. It pushed boundaries but also embraced the values of the time. The 1950s were a complex era, and rock and roll mirrored that complexity, reflecting both the tensions and the consensus of the age. The 1950s in America was a time of huge changes and excitement. The country was booming, and people were optimistic about the future. One of the biggest changes was the rise of rock and roll, a new kind of music that captured the hearts of young people across the nation. But rock and roll wasn't just about fun and dancing. It was also deeply connected to the broader American culture of the time, especially the idea of people's capitalism. During the 1950s, America was in the middle of the Cold War, a tense rivalry with the Soviet Union. The U.S. wanted to show the world that its system, democracy, and capitalism was the best. The success of American businesses, the growth of the middle class, and the abundance of consumer goods were all used to prove this point. The Advertising Council even came up with the phrase, "people's capitalism," to describe how everyone in America could share in the success and benefits of the capitalist system. Rock and roll became a perfect example of this people's capitalism. It was a business where anyone with talent, drive, and a bit of luck could make it big. Sam Phillips, a famous record producer, once said, "If I could only find a white man who had the Negro sound and the Negro feel, I could make $1 billion." When Elvis Presley came along, he proved Phillips right. Elvis's success showed that the American dream was real and achievable, just like in the Horatio Alger stories that inspired so many. By the late 1950s, teenagers had a lot of spending power. They were buying records, clothes, and all sorts of rock and roll related items. This created a new market that businesses were eager to tap into. Songs about cars, fashion, and even money became popular. For example, Elvis Presley's Money Honey and Little Richard's Rip It Up both celebrated the joy of spending. The top 40 charts were always changing, and teenagers kept buying new records to stay up to date. Rock and roll also helped create a new identity for teenagers. Before the 1950s, there wasn't really a distinct teenage culture. But with rock and roll, teenagers had their own music, fashion, and slang. They could connect with each other through the songs they listened to and the stars they idolized. This was a way for them to feel part of a group and to express their own unique identity. However, rock and roll wasn't just about breaking the rules. It also reflected and reinforced many of the mainstream values of the time. The 1950s saw a strong emphasis on traditional family values and religion. Many people turned to church for comfort and guidance in the face of the Cold War. Songs about God, heaven, and prayer were common. For example, Gloria Mann's Teenage Prayer and The Platters' My Prayer were big hits. Marriage and family were also celebrated in rock and roll. Songs like Church Bells May Ring and From a School Ring to a Wedding Ring promoted the idea of finding the perfect partner and settling down. Even the way women were portrayed in rock and roll reflected the traditional gender roles of the time. Women were often seen as sweet, supportive, and dependent on men. Songs like Eddie My Love showed a girl who was heartbroken and even suicidal without her boyfriend. The 1950s was a time when America was trying to present itself as a model of success and happiness to the world. Rock and roll played a big part in this, showing that the American way of life was exciting, prosperous, and full of opportunities. But it also reflected the more conservative aspects of the time, like the emphasis on family, religion, and traditional gender roles. Despite its rebellious image, rock and roll was in many ways a product of its time, capturing both the hopes and the expectations of 1950s America. Rock and roll is more than just music. It's a piece of history that tells the story of America in the 1950s. It captures the energy, fears, and hopes of a generation. By listening to the songs of that era, we can understand what it was like to grow up during a time of rapid change and tension. In the 1950s, rock and roll was a mirror reflecting the world around it. It showed how society treated women and men. For example, many songs portrayed men as strong and confident, while women were often seen as passive and in need of protection. Songs like Bo Diddley's I'm a Man and Who Do You Love highlighted this macho image with lyrics that emphasized male dominance and virility. Rock and roll also reflected the racial tensions of the time. The music industry was segregated, and black artists often faced discrimination. However, despite these challenges, black rock and roll artists like Chuck Berry and Fats Domino gained popularity, showing that cultural integration was happening even before the civil rights movement gained full momentum. Their success proved that people were ready for change, even if it was slow and sometimes difficult. The 1950s were also a time of anxiety. The Cold War brought fears of nuclear war, and these fears found their way into rock and roll. Songs like 13 Women by Bill Haley and his Comets and Stranded in the Jungle by the Cadets referenced atomic bombs and the threat of war. This shows how the music of the time was deeply connected to the worries and concerns of everyday people. Rock and roll was a battleground where different ideas and values clashed. It was a space where producers, consumers, and the establishment fought for control. Young people and adults often had different views, but they also shared many of the same beliefs and fears. This mix of rebellion and conformity is what makes rock and roll so fascinating. Elvis Presley became a symbol of the era. He embodied the dreams and aspirations of a generation. His success showed that with talent and hard work, anyone could achieve the American dream. By the end of the 1950s, Elvis was a king, and his fans were a testament to the power of rock and roll. In the end, rock and roll was a reflection of its time. It captured the spirit of a generation and helped shape American culture. It was a force for both change and continuity, and it continues to influence music and society today. The songs of the 1950s are more than just nostalgia. They are a window into a world that was changing, sometimes painfully, but always with a beat that couldn't be silenced.